All right, we'll get started. If people missed the very beginning, it's recorded, so you can watch it. All right, so good afternoon. Thank you for joining this Foretell in Conversation webinar. My name is Michael Page. I'm a CSET research fellow and the lead investigator of Foretell, a crowd forecasting project of Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Our featured speaker today is Terry Murray. Terry is a co-founder and CEO emeritus of Good Judgment, Inc. She advises Good Judgment's management team and serves as the chair of its board of directors. Prior to founding Good Judgment, Terry was the project manager for Good Judgment Project at UC Berkeley. Before that, she founded a consulting firm specializing in telecommunications and energy policy and was a division director at the California Public Utilities Commission. Before we dive in, some quick housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining by computer, we can't see you. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. We'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions. Terry, great to have you here.
Great to be here.
First question, which you can answer however you like, is how did you get into this business? How did you get into forecasting?
Well, I suppose one could argue that I got into forecasting even as an undergrad because I was an economics major. And of course, that's one of the standard activities for economists is building models for forecast. But in terms of the current incarnation of crowdsourced forecasting, it really started, back around 2010 or so, when I had been working with Phil Tatlock on a completely different project at UC Berkeley, and he and Barb Mellers, whom I've known for many, many years, asked me if I would be willing to get involved as a project manager for a grant proposal, or actually an R&D contract proposal they were putting in to an agency I'd never heard of, even though it rhymed with DARPA, which I did know of. And it was at the time where I was looking for the proverbial glide path to retirement, and this sounded like a great thing. It's a government project, 9 to 5, you can work from home. How perfect is that? Well, we were selected, of course. The Good Judgment Project was selected for a contract in the IARPA ACE program. And I quickly discovered that that was not what I thought I had signed up for, because academic researchers like Phil and Barb are really good at recruiting from their community of academics, all sorts of wonderful people on the research team. I was literally the only full-time person doing anything other than research. So all recruitment and management of forecasters, all management of the forecasting platform, anything, including, of course, all the contract paperwork and so on, reporting to IARPA, anything but that. But research was what I did. And I nearly died that first year, but it was a wonderful baptism of fire. I certainly learned a lot in a very short time about crowdsourced forecasting, including personally reading every comment posted on the platform by every forecaster in year 1 of the Good Judgment Project.
Wow, that's a lot of comments, I imagine. Anything particularly, what was most surprising to you about the comments that you reviewed?
That was so cool. And it's actually most surprising to me in retrospect, because we wanted to give participants feedback, of course. That's a core concept of improving as a forecaster. But early on, you don't have a lot of scores. Questions, as Foretell participants know, can run quite a while. And the first few scores aren't necessarily good indicators of what your performance is going to be on average. So we started to look at the comments and said, well, is there something we can do with this? And we developed little reports for folks that we gave them some data on the number of comments and theirs relative to other people's. But we also gave them examples, and I worked with Phil Tatlock on this. I would bring up what were proposed to be exemplary comments. And then we would explain to people why, what aspect of forecasting, were they using a base rate well? Were they highlighting well for other forecasters what would make them change their minds if they saw some new information? Or if they did, in fact, update their forecast, did they explain why and what had changed? So these were all really valuable concepts, and we called people out and put their screen names on the reports. And then I would start to see certain people popping up. In fact, we made a particular effort not to just call out the same people over and over. But when at the end of the first year of the Good Judgment Project, by virtue of their Breyer scores, we picked the first crop of super forecasters. I was amazed to see how many of those people had been among the very first folk identified for exemplary comments. And this is one of the things that carried all the way through, that good process is, in fact, certainly highly correlated with good outcomes. You can't get there only through good process, and you certainly need a certain amount of inherent talent, but that was really cool and it excited me. I guess the other thing that I found intriguing, though, was some of the backgrounds of the forecasters and how they knew things. We had a forecaster who was a professor of divinity, and I'm scratching my head, geopolitical forecasting. So I also was the one who interacted, did the help desk with forecasters, and he sent a help desk message once, and I said, hey, I can't help. I'm so curious, like, what's this all about? And he said, well, actually, I have this global network of former students who are out as missionaries all over the world. If we have a question about Mali, I email my former student who's on the ground there and ask, what's going on in Mali today? Can you give me the local perspective? And afterward, I realized that the CIA had very similar, or OSS had some very similar foundations. So there were just lots of cool things about seeing the diverse backgrounds of people who proved to be excellent forecasters, who weren't professors of political science, even though we had those too.
And I want to come back to the kind of the ideal composition of a forecaster pool and what makes somebody good at forecasting. But first, on the comments, we discussed this last week a little bit. I'm thinking about what types of comments we should be encouraging forecasters to leave, both to make it to incentivize them to think in the most productive way about the question, and to provide the most useful information to other forecasters who are reading their comments. And so you mentioned, what would change your mind? So that seems like an example. Are there other examples that you think should be, like, if there were like a 3-point template for what kinds of comments to leave, what would be on that template?
Certainly your sources. What data are you relying on? And then, as I mentioned, also base rates. What's your starting point? But yes, what would make you change your mind? In general, though, I would emphasize that comments are not just for other forecasters. They are also for you. We all are victims of hindsight bias. And I've just been reading Tim Harford's new book, The Data Detective, and he has great examples of how people remember their forecasts and predictions quite differently from what they were at the time, and their reasoning. You're never going to improve if you can't go back and find this record. Here's what I actually said I was thinking. And this was, just having your forecast itself written down helps. So there's that, but you want to give enough information so that you and other forecasters can understand the basic underpinnings of your thinking, and then that you can do analysis in retrospect, and certainly potentially so that the consumer of the forecast will understand, well, what was this based on?
And a related question is, I mean, you were involved with the first group of super forecasters, so you got to see firsthand what made somebody super forecaster, what qualities they had, like what differentiated them from everybody else, what they did to go from a non-super forecaster to a super forecaster. What tips, I guess, could you provide to the forecasters watching right now who want to be in the super forecaster camp?
Well, and I think we actually have some who are, but I will say this, another book that's out recently, Adam Grant's Think Again, actually features two of our professional super forecasters. And one of them, Kirsty Morell, is quoted in the book as having the joy of being wrong. That is such an unbelievable phrase because none of us likes to be wrong. But from her perspective, and she does come from a scientific background, being wrong and understanding why you were wrong is an opportunity to be less wrong the next time, to not repeat the mistakes of the past. So one thing that super forecasters tend to have is what we call actively open-minded thinking, that they do have priors. Nobody starts a forecasting question. Well, you might start it if you're not an expert in the field, completely blank. But once you make your first forecast and do some research, you've got priors. But you don't latch onto those like a hedgehog and say, this is the way it is. I know it for sure. And all I'm going to look for is confirming information. A super forecaster is actually more likely to say, what if I'm wrong? Let me go look for what would I expect to see that I haven't taken account of, and go look for that information. And keep looking. If they don't find it the first time, they just keep looking, and they're excited if someone else brings it up to them. That's hard for me, but then I'm no super forecaster. And just sticking with it. I mean, our CEO, Warren Hatch, became a super forecaster. He was in year one of the Good Judgment Project. He was not one of the first group of super forecasters. And he realized he had to up his game in year two, and he did. And the rest is history.
I mean, it's definitely good to know that the data suggests a learnable skill. So those of us who are not there on day one still have a chance.
Absolutely.
In your experience, does this trait of the best forecasters carry over into non-forecast, non like formal forecasting contexts, like when people are debating or discussing something with like friends or colleagues? Do they engage in the same type of epistemic humility?
Slightly controversial point. To some degree, I will say super forecasters are unusually good about that. But we have an internal platform we use called Basecamp. It's similar to Slack or other things like that. And the super forecasters have a forum there. They often discuss among themselves topics that aren't forecasting questions. And the debates can get pretty heated. I recently commented there that, yes, I feel more comfortable because of the norms of that group that they can show some epistemic humility, and they are more likely to be gleeful almost if one of their colleagues says, well, you might think that, but did you read this? And they'll read that and go, well, I stand corrected. It is tougher when you get to emotional topics that are close to your heart. And I have seen instances there where it touches on something very core to someone's identity. And then you do see even a super forecaster finding it difficult to let go of this. And I think one of our early super forecasters summarized this really well. One of the personality surveys we have to correlate talks about whether you're open to changing your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And she objected to the word belief because she associated that with her religious beliefs. And for her, those were a matter of faith, and we all respect that. But so, you know, it just goes to show that people do have parts of their existence that are more or less susceptible to this kind of questioning. And that's, by the way, another reason why crowdsourcing is so important. If you have a diverse crowd, even though there might be each of us have our personal blind spots, we hope that they're different blind spots and that our colleagues, hopefully politely and gently, can help us to see them, but also that we don't force consensus. So the consensus can kind of pass us by where we're just not ready to go somewhere.
Right. I don't know if you saw Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, had this essay about keeping your identity small. Are you familiar with that? That seems a bit related to what you're discussing regarding people's ability to forecast on and think about topics that are kind of close to themselves. Do you, and I want to, you know, we can take like religion out of this, because I think the article was written in the context of politics. So that's maybe a less controversial example.
Not these days.
Right, right. And so I think Paul Graham's hypothesis would be people who don't define themselves in terms of certain political beliefs are better able to kind of think clearly about issues that implicate those political beliefs. Does that ring true to you in the context of a feature that super forecasters have?
It does, although I will say some of the supposed failures of crowdsourced forecasting back in 2016, Trump's election as president, Brexit, went to areas where, and frankly, I think it might show a lack of diversity, not a complete lack, but a lack of diversity, because we've all been recruiting forecasters primarily from college-educated groups. There's a certain scientific mindset that we're openly seeking in our forecasters. And so we don't necessarily have, and then the original IARPA recruitment, we were allowed to recruit people from outside, from non-US citizens, but the original ACE program actually allowed us only to submit data from US citizens. That requirement got relaxed. So to me, there is a certain amount of groupthink there, and I think we talked about this last week. This applies even in something as simple as Google searches. And it's one of these tensions between making forecasting easier by having data feeds, for example, on platform. But then if you have a data feed about a question, you've just prejudiced the sample of data that the majority of your forecasters will see. If I primarily go to alt-right websites, a Google search will feed me very different things from someone who proudly identifies as a left liberal. And if you're a native English speaker and you normally read English language websites, you will see different things from what someone who is a native speaker somewhere else sees. So diversity of information sources is absolutely critical. And I think these failures that we had came in part from people, and we did have some forecasters, many of whom happen to live in flyover country, as we call it, warning folks, you know, the lawn signs I see here don't have any Clintons on them.
Right. Obviously the theory behind why crowd forecasting works makes it clear that diversity is important, because what you're trying to do is aggregate different sources of information and different parsings of that information. And the data, as far as I can tell, supports that. More diverse groups are better than less diverse groups, all else being the same. And certainly the crowd of forecasters that Good Judgment has, that Foretell has, is wanting in diversity along many dimensions. Mostly male, mostly quantitatively inclined, certain backgrounds, economics, math, computer science, tend to be younger people that are more internet savvy. But basically, what is your view on the dimensions of diversity on which we are most wanting, and how we can, and like basically why that's so problematic and how we can do better?
Right. Of course, the infamous one is females, especially females of childbearing age and parenting age. That is a known problem across the internet. Even studies have shown that even Wikipedia editors, which you wouldn't think would be a terribly gender-specific activity, women are underrepresented. But we're also underrepresented in, as you say, educational groups. We actually had, because again, we were recruiting for the requirements, and one of the requirements of the ACE program was an undergraduate degree. There was a little relaxing of that over time. But we had people writing in saying, really angry with us, saying, you only value people with a college degree, and I could be a great forecaster. I have a lot of interest in these issues, and I don't know why you won't let me participate. I do think we have an issue there. And then because, as you say, Paige, we do this on the internet. First place, obviously you have to have access to the internet, ready access to the internet, and that tends to have certain demographic correlates. And certainly if you look globally, it has very strong, you think of, we don't have a lot of forecasters from the continent of Africa. And the ones that Good Judgment has are people who are like investment bankers, which is probably not the ideal sampling of the population. Most forecasting that I know of is done on English language platforms. We have worked with some organizations in the Middle East who were trying to recruit in the Arab world and run their own forecasting. And that was a great effort, although we did see that there are big cultural differences. And it was a challenge for some of those folks to wrap their heads around what we were doing. So I think we need to reach out more, and maybe some of it is making the activity easier, less time consuming. We have this template that came out of ACE. We do these long questions, and your scores depend in part on being able to update and all of these things. And that's certainly an important form of forecasting, but it's a very personal, resource intensive kind of forecasting. Can we find ways to make it easier? A lot more people have a cell phone, even in the developing world. Are there ways to do quick surveys that get fed in and aggregated with perhaps other pooled information from more traditional forecasters? Can we pay people? I've told you that I have a personal beef that we treat forecasters a lot like the gig economy, and Good Judgment Inc. has been working hard to try to get compensation up, but to the extent that crowdsourced forecasting organizations basically compete against each other on price, we're just facilitating exploitation of people who are providing tremendous value. I do think adding the label pro helps. If we quit treating this as a substitute for other quote unquote leisure time activities, which might include time with your family, and treat it as another way to earn income so that people can keep their work-life balance intact. That might help. But really, it's up to us to make forecasting friendly to a bigger group of people. And that means also having them see forecasters like them, not white male talking heads who start speaking in probabilities.
I will mention no probabilities for the next 40 minutes. So certainly it seems like one way to improve diversity would be to pay forecasters, pay them more. Excuse me. And one way to do that would be for forecasting just to be a bigger deal generally. I mean, I imagine if the demand for it is orders of magnitude higher than it is today, there will be many more people forecasting, which will, I think, inevitably make it more diverse, because if a large fraction of the population is forecasting, it has to be more diverse than it is today, more or less. So this then I think is relates to your view of what you would like the world to look like in 10 years, which you mentioned last week. I thought it was really nice. What the world, like Terry's preferred world 10 years from now, what is the role of forecasting?
The role of forecasting is that, as Phil Petlock and Dan Gardner say in Super Forecasting, forecasting is everywhere, every aspect of our lives. But instead of that being a hidden fact, it becomes overt. And whenever you open your equivalent, your virtual newspaper equivalent of 10 years from now, instead of just seeing 30% chance of rain, you also see 30% chance that the filibuster will be modified, or you see 30% chance that there will be traffic jams that keep you from getting to work on time in your hover car, or whatever it is. And that we talk to each other that way because we know, and particularly in the public policy government sector, we know there's a history of vague verbiage causing problems. When we say likely and maybe and so on, there's a great psychological literature that asks people, well, how would you associate this with some odds or a probability? And I'll use that word now. And you find that some of these words, like likely, mean such a wide array of things to people that the infamous example is the advice given to Kennedy about the Bay of Pigs and the odds of success. And the words that he heard, he interpreted as a better than 50% chance, where the advisors giving him those opinions in qualitative terms meant that maybe 1 in 3 at best. And one has to wonder if the whole operation would have gone forward if that misunderstanding had been cleared up.
Yeah, I was talking with people affiliated with the intelligence community, and I mean, they were talking about how they process intelligence, like the intelligence you're discussing, and they wanted a point estimate for a certain figure, and I asked whether they ever request confidence intervals, something to evidence how uncertain the point estimate is, and the answer is basically no. So I imagine that is an example of one of the things you'd like to see done differently in policymaking in 10 years.
It is absolutely. Here's the challenge. First, and Jason Matheny was a pioneer in this, as in so many other things. In the ACE program, in years 2 and 3, one of the aspects was communicating forecasts. And it was a more experimental aspect. And we were challenged to put some kind of confidence interval around it. I remember talking with the statisticians, some very eminent ones who were involved with that part of the project. And there are some serious issues about what a confidence interval around a crowdsourced forecast even means.
Sure.
That being said, I think there's a lot of work being done, and including at Good Judgment, on something that is called continuous forecasting, which was originally going to be part of the ACE program, but was dropped because there was a bit of an apples and oranges problem for a program like that that has to have hard metrics in comparing the continuous to the discrete forecasts. What people are doing is looking at different ways to elicit the underlying distribution of opinions of individual forecasters, and then to find ways of aggregating those. Sometimes we do that already in sort of binned forecasts, which I'm sure you're doing on Foretell. You have intervals, what's the likelihood that the outcome will fall into any one of these buckets. And that can be aggregated and transformed statistically into a continuous distribution. There are ways that people ask, and we've seen different interfaces on some platforms that let people drag around something that looks like a probability distribution and give their attributes. But there's already a problem for getting most people to understand a probability. Like there's a 75% chance that this is going to happen. Sometimes it's better if you turn that into the odds are 3 to 1. People have a little more familiarity from sports and other kind of betting with that concept. But we need better education across the board so that people consuming forecasts understand what uncertainty and ranges of uncertainty really mean. One of my favorite examples here is that you look at a weather forecast, and when it says 30% chance of rain, the icon next to that usually shows a cloud with raindrops coming down from it, because people get more annoyed if they take an umbrella with them, or don't take an umbrella rather, and they end up needing it than they do if, okay, it was a nuisance, I had to lug the umbrella and it didn't rain today. That's the kind of thing. So adding uncertainty on top of that, we just did an uncertainty distribution around our COVID forecasts that covered the year ending March 31st. And if you look at the initial intervals, it would be fair for someone to say, so it could be basically from 0 to infinity. Thanks for the help. I kind of knew that. What is really impressive though is when you track that over time, how quickly the super forecasters narrowed that interval, and the fact that the median forecasts in many cases, even from day one, were pretty close to what actually happened. It's amazing what people can forecast. Certainly we'd never done that in the world. Had never had a COVID pandemic before.
Right. One of the things you said was people not knowing what 75% means, or some people not. Good Judgment and Foretell and everybody else interested in this space really wants policymakers to use these methods more. What are your views on the obstacles to that happening? And so, one of them might be not knowing what 75% means, but what do you think are the biggest obstacles we need to overcome?
Well, one of them, and this surprised me because it came up not only in an early conversation we had with some high-level folks at DoD, but a few months later came up when we were talking to a quantitative hedge fund, is the bare numbers don't cut it. We were asked bluntly by a general, how do I know you're not right for the wrong reasons? And at the time I gave the sort of statistician's answer. That's a great question. If you're talking about one forecasting question, you don't, and I'm not going to pretend. And it starts to get more reliable, but at that point, the Good Judgment Project and its forecasters had forecasts on several hundred questions. I said, And to get this level of accuracy relative to a control group over that many questions is vanishingly low in probability. It's still possible. We could be right for the wrong reasons. But when I heard a similar thing from the quantitative hedge fund, not that they're a little more statistically savvy, but they said they actually preferred to call in these vague verbiage sell side analysts on the Wall Street, the sell side, or the people who just put out the research reports. They're not and saying what's going to happen with a stock or something like that. The buy side are the people who actually do the investing. And the quant hedge fund preferred to call these people in, hear their stories, query them, and then digest that, be their own forecasters, digest all of that data and create their own forecasts. So what we've learned over time is that the story matters. And I think that's probably going to be even more true in government than it is certainly in finance, because that's what government decision makers are used to getting. Analyst reports are stories. And yes, increasingly, and to its credit, the intelligence community has been working toward bringing in the quantitative side as well, and even standardizing what ranges of probabilities are associated with certain kinds of qualitative terms. But at least for the current generation of decision makers, if you don't provide the story, I don't think you're going to get there. So for me, that might be one of the biggest things. And then a lot of it is just education. And this is where we've been really happy. I always like to think of it, I call it the apple in the schools policy, to be doing training seminars at different things like the war colleges and so on, where a whole generation of new leaders is getting direct exposure to these techniques and even themselves forecasting. And that's just, I mean, I look at my grandkids and it's really embarrassing. They've had, access to smartphones since before they could speak. And they swipe and they do this and that, and grandma's like, wait, what are you doing? That's what's going to happen for, there's a big chunk of just time, but we have to do our jobs in the meantime and get these concepts out there and expose people. And I think not sell it as an alternative to traditional analysis, because that's threatening, but sell it as a supplement. It's a second opinion. Who doesn't value a second opinion? It's a red team. We've had actuarial companies ask us to forecast on things that go to insurance rate setting. And I kind of scratched my head, but they said they really wanted to see the commentary to see if in a changing environment, there were factors that our forecasters coming fresh without their usual models looked at that were relevant that they had missed.
Right.
So if we partner with government analysts and help them rather than say we can do your job better, pretty no-brainer.
So this is encouraging. I mean, so we know that people with quantitative backgrounds are more likely to be forecasting and are probably more receptive to forecasting outputs because they are familiar with statistical language, jargon. And many decision makers are lawyers, and I can say this because I am a lawyer, or used to be a lawyer. Lawyers generally don't do numbers, kind of infamously so. That's a whole other rant that I can go down later. But in your experience, working with the War College and these like training approaches or training classes, is there hope even for lawyers to be able to understand and incorporate these techniques into their thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, first, we do have super forecasters who have law degrees. Not all of them are practicing attorneys, but But I'll go back much earlier in my career when I worked at the California Public Utilities Commission. And I was an advisor to one of the commissioners and had access. These were politicians mostly. A lot of people, if they don't get reelected, they get a gubernatorial appointment to a group like this or something like that. And what impressed me was the ones who took it seriously. I mean, we had some who obviously were just looking for a place to go when they lost re-election. But they were eager to come to grips with quantitative information. And again, it's much more about your ability to communicate that information. And this is a big area that's getting improvement. I think we all need to work on data visualization. And again, I go back to Tim Harford's book, The Data Detective, where, many of you may have taken or read Edward Tufte's work and so on. But instead of necessarily super data dense things, we need to find, Harford talks about having his own personal mental benchmarks that he uses to put things in perspective, like how high is the Empire State Building or things like that. So if you look at, we need to spend more time as a community finding ways other than our traditional graphics of showing the trend of forecasting probabilities over time. Shame on us if we don't make it easy for lawyers and anyone, motorcycle mechanics, chefs, whatever, because after all, even a chef does a lot, I'm not actually good at baking. I'm much better at cooking because I like to do a little in taste. This precise measurement, the chemistry of baking. There are a lot of people we don't think of as quantitative who are really sophisticated. So shame on us if we don't meet them where they are.
Yep, that all sounds right to me. And I've always been blown away by how sophisticated people get when it comes to like fantasy sports.
Yeah.
It's a fun leisure activity, but if you pile on enough interest, all of a sudden it becomes quite sophisticated, and people like learn how to parse numbers statistically, who might not have ever done it before. And it is baffling to me that we can't do something similar with public policy decisions. But hopefully, in the next 10 years, we will. I'm going to start, if you have questions, add into the Q&A. I see we have some starting to roll in, or you could throw them in the chat. And I have other questions of my own, but I'll try not to be too selfish. One question we've gotten is about how to encourage people to forecast more and more often. And you mentioned this a bit, I think, when you talked about trying to make forecasting easier, easier to do on your phone. Other tips for how to encourage people to forecast more and more often?
And I give Cultivate full credit here. They not only do your platform, but they do our Good Judgment Open platform, which is our big public forecast. Lots of simple automated things like setting a reminder. I think a great analogy, my son gave me Duolingo for Christmas, and his family, the plus version, so that I could dust off my very, very stale high school French and perhaps learn Latin, which I have another reason for wanting to learn, etc. And, those kinds of apps have done a tremendous amount of thinking about how to motivate people. Now, gamification on Robinhood might be something that we worry about from public policy reasons, but gamification for, and simple things like when I get a message that I've got a 133-day streak going, I actually last night sat down after watching TV and I felt really bad that I hadn't put in at least 10 minutes of French last night. And I did it before going to bed because I couldn't stand having my streak go. So, making it small, doable chunks, making it fun. Community, though, I think is such a huge thing. And this is one of the reasons that I think in our randomized controlled trials, both team forecasting and prediction markets just had higher engagement rates. It's fun to interact with other people. So a little friendly competition, but a lot more of the sense of we're all in it together and we're trying to achieve something. And we shouldn't hesitate. I think this is where Foretell has done well, to invoke the public good. Most of us actually would like to find ways to do good for the world. I'm sorry if I'm revealing my Oberlin, naivete here from my undergrad years, but I genuinely believe that the vast majority of human beings want other people to be better off and would cheerfully, if it were 10 minutes a day, spend that time. But there has to be something in it for them. And when you learn from other people, that's exciting. When you learn to think more clearly, and forecasters talk about how that's applied in their everyday lives and how they can think even more sensibly about whether they should repair the broken plumbing or get a new water heater. These are things we have to make it clear that these kinds of critical thinking skills will help you everywhere. Although I will admit, I still can't get over my problem of not adding an extra 10 to 15 minutes for getting from the parking garage to the place I'm going when I get the Google Maps estimate of how long it takes me to get somewhere.
Ultimately, we're only human. In one of the things you said relates to another question we received, which is about in your work with ACE and Focus, you commented on the importance of teams and team dynamics. What can Foretell do differently, or what lessons should we be trying to incorporate into forecasting based on what you learned from those programs and the importance of teamwork?
I think there are a couple of things, and it's actually interesting that our professional super forecasters, although still nominally organized in teams, don't work in teams quite in the same way that we did in the Good Judgment Project, where each team was a unit unto itself and didn't communicate with all the other teams. That I think partly is because they've gotten to know one another so well. There's what is it, Dunbar's number, about 150. When you've got long-standing relationships, a number of people going up to about that many can communicate, but especially when people are getting started, having a small team where you're getting scored based on your team performance. So there's already an incentive to cooperate and not to withhold information. There's always this issue, we have leaderboards and all of this, and that's a problem because we're incentivizing people in part not to cooperate, not to share information. You really want to create that esprit de corps and that sense that you're also not that if someone criticizes your forecast or says you're wrong, that they're doing that because they want it to be a better forecast. They're not out to get you. They're your buddies. There was such a strong correlation between teams that was probably as successful an intervention. The best teams did better than sometimes most individual super forecasters.
One question we received is about super forecasters, not just what people did to become super forecasters, but how you've seen them change or improve once they're in the group of super forecasters.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, just one of these great examples about how we lift one another up. even in the good judgment projects, teams were highly variable, at least the regular teams, in how committed or active. And it can be a bit discouraging if you're on a team of a dozen people and only 2 of you ever talk. You get into a group of super forecasters, and first, everyone has an opinion. And everyone has an opinion that is supported by some kind of actual research that they will share and analysis. And then there's the back and forth. And one of my favorite comments, we had conferences for our super forecasters during the 8 days. And a fellow from the UK who came to the conference at Berkeley wrote a blog post after it. And he said, it's like ET phone home. I finally found my people. A lot of us nerdy types weren't the most popular kids in high school. But you get among a like-minded community that has the same values of open-minded thinking and really doing the research and trying to be more accurate. That just lifts everyone's game. It's amazing.
How do you suggest forecasters think about the real world effects of their forecasts? I mean, this might bite particularly hard when you're trying to inform policymaking. So, one approach could be just ignore the policy relevance of the question and try to forecast as accurately as possible. But do forecasters have an obligation to try to figure out what the effect of their forecast would be on the world?
That's so difficult. This goes back to the early days of our COVID forecasting, where one of our super forecasters raised the issue to others, like if we underestimate the severity of what could be happening, will we then lead policymakers or anyone looking at our forecasts to not do enough? And there was a big debate within the group where I think they landed on, generally, although again, we don't force consensus, it's an aggregated crowd forecast. Most people landed on that means that we're obligated to put even more effort in to do the best we can. But for us to distort our true opinions is a dangerous confound. And I have to say, I experienced this back in my regulation days when I was working as the head of the Division of Ratepayer Advocates, and we had to put out expert witness testimony for the to inform the commission's decisions. And when you get to the point where you're negotiating with yourself about how to present your opinions and whether to leave some data out or to spin something a certain way, I think that's very dangerous in an analyst. It's so tempting if you care deeply, but at the end of the day, I still feel that the ethics here are to double down on effort and research and analysis, but to be honest. And that's one reason why we like to use proper scoring rules that have all the incentive for people to report their true beliefs.
Great. You mentioned earlier that some people have a misconception about the role of forecasting. It's been sometimes presented as a silver bullet, a substitute for other methods, rather than one of many inputs or something that can be supplementary to what people are currently doing. What do you think have been the biggest framing mistakes for forecasting that would be useful to sort of undo if we're to realize this 10-year success story you've described?
Well, we need to keep working on what has been called the rigor relevance trade-off. A lot of people in government looked at questions that came out of the eighth tournament or so on, and we needed questions that were rigorously resolvable. So you know exactly which outcome was correct when you get to the end of the question. Sometimes in the process of doing that, the questions can come to seem like trivial pursuits. You want to know, what's really going on in China? Are they really getting more aggressive toward the West, et cetera? And you end up asking very specific questions. And one of the ones that goes back to ACE days is we were trying to get at incidents in, I believe it was the South China Sea. So there was a question about whether there would be a lethal confrontation between forces, people in the South China Sea. It ended up resolving yes, nearly at the last day of forecasting, when everything had been decrementing down to zero, reasonably so, when the captain of a fishing boat got into a squabble with someone and there was a fatal accident. Obviously, the geopolitical significance of that was pretty close to nil. And that was a great example where, with all the best intentions in the world, questions had been posed that just didn't get to that. There are techniques that were piloted in the Good Judgment Project that Good Judgment Inc. keeps using that we call question clusters, so that you can build up a set of related questions that may individually be rigorous, but they get at different parts of a phenomenon, and they can help you to answer the bigger fuzzy questions. And we have done some of that work with government folks. We also had experiments, less successfully, with so-called fuzzy questions back in ACE days, and forecasters tend not to like questions where the resolution is going to be somewhat judgmental. We may need to work on being a little more comfortable with that. But a lot of it also goes to treating the skill of question development as a major skill set. That's something we pride ourselves on at Good Judgment. We have people now who have been writing forecasting questions for many, many years, and to have done all the good process that we try to do as forecasters, post-mortems and pre-mortems before the questions go out. Like, how could this go wrong? What Chinese fishing boat captain could wreck this question? And there is a tremendous skill to teasing that out. So we need to give more respect to question writing and to using some of these techniques of linking scenario to which Phil Tetlock and Peter Skoblik had a piece recently linking scenario analysis to rigorous forecasting. Just pull all these pieces of looking at the future together and not treat just one-off crowdsourced forecasting questions as the end-all and be-all.
Wonderful. I couldn't agree with all that more. Our time is basically up. Terry, I'm so grateful you were willing to talk with us today. Any parting comments for our viewers, for our forecasters?
Well, first, because I have seen them, hi to everybody who said hi. It's great to see all of you there. But for those who are relatively new to this activity, please stick with it. We need you. And please help bring other people in. And I say that with a little trepidation, because recruitment within one's personal network does tend to reinforce the attributes of the network. So please think about your friends and colleagues who might not look just like you, and help convince them that this is a great thing to do. Get the word out. If you want to go beyond crowdsourced national security questions, you can send your friends to a platform like Good Judgment Open, where there's a diverse set of questions. That can be an easier intro. Not everyone wants to geek out on national security,
Mhm.
but whatever you do, please forecast.
Wonderful. Thank you, Terry. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Have a great day. Bye all.
You too. Take care.